p.m. and I will officially call to order the Wednesday, October 1, 2014 meeting of the DRCOG MetroVision Issues Committee. The first thing I would like to do is to give a very, very warm welcome to have our Executive Director, Jennifer Schaffel, back with us at this meeting.
Thank you. Good to be back.
It is a privilege to have you with us, Jennifer, and we thank you for being here. The next item on our agenda is public comment. This is an opportunity for members of the public who wish to address the MVIC to come forward to the microphone and speak to any issue of relevance to the committee. The chair requests that there be no public comment on issues for which a prior public hearing has been held before the Board of Directors, so as not to taint that record. Are there any members of the public who would wish to come forward at this time and address the MVIC? Going once, going twice, fair warning. Going the third time, and we thank you. Public comment is closed. We now turn to the summary of September 3, 2014 meeting. Those materials were previously distributed to you electronically. Hard copies are also available. For those of you who do not have them accessible, no formal action is required relative to the minutes. They are submitted. We do, however, invite any comment that you may have if you would like to make a comment, so that Connie could make a note for the record. Are there any comments to be made to the minutes? None. Then the minutes stand as accepted. Then we move on to our one and only action item, and this is item number 4, and that's to call for a motion to recommend to the Board of Directors the inclusion of first last mile connections as part of the second phase project selection criteria for the development of the 2016-2021 Transportation Improvement Program. To refresh your recollection on this briefly, going back to the minutes that we just discussed, we did have a motion that was presented at the last meeting, which was passed unanimously, to recommend to the Board of Directors the 6 second phase project criteria for development of the 2016-2021 Transportation Improvement Program as recommended by staff, and also to include criteria to address first last mile. Then, pursuant to a motion that had passed prior to that, we had a direction to staff to provide criteria presented to us focusing on first last mile projects, so that we might articulate that more clearly for the board when the matter comes up to the board for consideration of the 6 already approved factors to be included for consideration. And so for this discussion now, relative to first last mile, because that's the subject matter before us, we turn to our very capable, talented, and experienced Transportation Planning and Operations Director, Mr. Douglas Rex. Good afternoon, Mr. Rex.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. And really, I'll just get right into it. I think the Chairman did a great job of summarizing where we were last time. You did ask us to do a little bit of research and provide to you a definition for your consideration, at least something to start with as far as trying to reach a foundation on what first and last mile may or may not be, so for your consideration to include as one of the criteria or guiding principles, whatever you want to call it, for project selection in second phase. So first last mile connection, and just so we're all on the same page, and we put this in the memo itself, I think everybody would agree that a trip really represents a travel that is the entire journey of the trip, from origin to destination, whatever that might be. And you know, first last mile has really become a hotbed issue lately because, quite frankly, all the amazing transit infrastructure that we are constructing here within our region, whether that be rail and or the bus connections to that there's an understanding that, you know, once you get off that train on that platform, how do you get to your final destination? And it's going to certainly become a growing issue, and we understand that. And one of the difficulties with transit versus, really most other modes is that once you get off that bus or off that train, it is not quite clear exactly, or it's not obvious sometimes about how to get to that final destination. Sure, you can maybe dodge cars and jump obstacles to get to your final destination, but what we hope to do is define for you those types of projects in relation to the TIP policy document that would be eligible. So really, what we and this is the little illustration we had in the packet for you was just to show you exactly what that means. And I don't know if it's fuzzy up here, or is it just my eyes? But really, the first and last mile we're talking about is normally can be handled by active transportation modes such as pedestrian sidewalks or bicycle facilities or something like that. And it really helps us to connect that origin to the train station or the bus stop, and then ultimately from the bus stop to your final destination. So we've defined it, or at least our recommendation to define this is any project that helps to expand or improve access to and from transit. We also believe that it should be safe, intuitive, and universally accessible, those able-bodied people and not. For second phase purposes, we're really referring to bike ped projects and transit connections. Now, we certainly understand that there are other types of first and last mile projects. And we list some in your package, such as there's certain bicycle crossing treatments, bike sharing, car sharing initiatives. But those projects are not eligible project types within the TIP call for projects. So what we try to do is really isolate the types of projects that we're talking about to those that are eligible within the TIP call. So if we're looking for a larger discussion and definition of what a first and last mile is, I think it would include those that I just listed as well. Is there any questions on that?
Are there questions for Doug Rex? I see Mayor Cernanek.
Well, my question would be on this.
Yeah. Okay. I'll just go there. So with that definition, basically,
Having said that, Mayor, we do have a question from the Commissioner for the comments. So, Commissioner Jones.
I think the point you just made is a particularly important one, which is the definition of first and last mile. I think is something that's going to come up continuously throughout our work, given the prominence that it's had in some of the regional or the economic development strategies and some other things that we're working on. So what you just said is we're just defining it for the TIP, but we're not actually doing the definition, and I think we need to make a note of that, write that down somewhere so we understand if indeed we're not doing a full definition of this, because it is going to come up again, I bet you, in MetroVision or some of it, right? So I just wanted us to pause, note that, you note that, so that we don't lose these important pieces when we're doing other work.
Definitely. Thank you. Duly noted. Yes.
And we have Councilor Jones.
So it makes sense to me, the last bullet point about what's included in terms of the second phase. What I don't understand is, it sounds like we're just limiting it to capital construction, right?
Correct.
Not TDM. Got that. That makes sense. How is it that pedestrian crossings aren't considered capital? Because of the list that you mentioned, that's the one that seemed different, and I didn't get that.
Right. They're not standalone projects as far as a project type within our categories for the TIP. Now, those treatments are certainly eligible as what do we call them, add-ons or parts of projects, and we certainly anticipate and expect that those will be parts of those projects, but they're not as standalone projects.
So if integrated in a project, then pedestrian crossing treatments would in fact be eligible TIP project types. But it's not the type, I'm sorry.
It's a component of the project.
A component, thank you. That was the word I was struggling for. Thank you.
Yep.
And are you ready for Mayor Cernanek's question? Or
well, I'll just, real quickly, let me just summarize this page. I know you guys all have it in your packets, but so with that definition, that basically is something that provides provides better access to transit and is universally accessible. God, what else do we call it? Universally accessible, safe, and intuitive. The types of projects, and this just summarizes basically in, well, it provides more detail to the last bullet on the last slide, the types of projects that would be eligible. The staff would look at when we're exploring the list of projects that are eligible for second phase, that we can provide information back to you if they're first or last mile. So it would be bike and pedestrian projects that touch transit or eliminate a barrier that impedes patrons from accessing transit. And also, it would also include roadway projects that have a bicycle pedestrian component. They have facilities included within that project that basically do the same thing as the bike ped standalone projects do. And last and certainly not least are really our transit projects, circulator and or shuttle projects that provide that last mile connection from a transit station or a bus stop to a destination. And this this large box we have over here really speaks to what all these projects are required to provide. They must provide a connection to a destination, and we have in parentheses what they may be, as well as fill a gap. You know, so you might have a situation in which, I think this came up, Robin, you might recall in the phase 1 criteria when we talked about, there's some concerns about, you know, at a transit station there might be some pretty good access, but then, you know, 1/8 of a mile beyond that, maybe not. So we wanted to make sure that if it doesn't connect, if it doesn't provide direct connection to the transit station or stop, that somewhere within that mile distance it does. And that's the last thing I would like to point out, that we did put curbs on this. We are suggesting that the project must fulfill this requirement within a 1 mile buffer. You know, I know there's a lot of pros and cons to that. It's really hard to define the distance as long as it's making it's providing that connection that you want. But we felt, for quite frankly, for ease of being able to make that determination, try to make it as less subjective as possible, that if we provided that 1 mile buffer, it would really certainly help staff in being able to make that determination.
Are we ready for Mayor Cernat?
Yes, sir.
And then I'll call on Mayor Atchison after that, and Councilor Presley. And I didn't say Rob. Thank you. Okay.
Rex, just looking at the shuttle and circulator projects and looking for maybe greater clarity with what that is, building on Commissioner Jones' comments, this is for capital construction that's going to be lasting, you know, all of those criteria that we have. This is not a shuttle equipment, it's not shuttle maintenance or a circulator maintenance. This is actually for capital construction. And so in the context of shuttle and circulator, what might be qualifying in that category?
Well, there is an exception with regards to capital construction, and that's for transit projects. We have 2 project types for transit-related service. One is transit service, and then the other is the capital side, is the capital, and this would be the actual service. So that is the operating expenses associated with that service is an eligible project type.
Okay. And then, excuse me, Mayor Atchison.
Just looking at the definition and what you've encompassed in there, I think this is an extremely broad opportunity for the phase 2 stuff. I think you'd be hard pressed to find something that doesn't fit, more so than trying to eliminate stuff. So if it's a construction project or a capital project that we're doing just about in any form, it gets into the phase 2 selection, I think it's going to qualify, at least for consideration. Doesn't mean it'll get approved, but at least for consideration, it's going to get a qualification.
Yeah, and you're right. That's an important point to make, that it is for consideration, and also that I hope all the projects qualify for this, because that's, you know, ultimately is a direction we would like to go. But there are some, you know, I would suggest there are going to be bicycle facilities that have been submitted that are not next to transit stops or stations, so they would not be eligible, for example. But you are right. it's pretty broad.
Yeah.
I have Councilor Presley.
Mayor Tisdale, I appreciate it. I feel like the guy at the art auction who scratched his eye and learned that he later purchased a Picasso. I was just rubbing my hands. I don't have a question. Thank you.
In anticipation of the approval of the motion. Well, thank you. We appreciate that. Councilor Knish.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I, kind of building off of Herb's comment, but maybe going in a little bit different direction, which is that it is very broad, and I wonder if we don't want to prioritize a hair more. It's not a screen, right? You don't have to be a last mile connection to qualify in the second phase of the TIP. It's simply like if we wanted to say this is a priority of ours, it allows us to, maybe the staff will pull out those projects and look at them and, you know, maybe give them some focus. So that's my understanding of what we're talking about. So first of all, I want to make sure that's correct.
That
right?
is definitely correct.
So, but it's hard to focus if everything fits. So one suggestion that I was thinking about, the phase one, when we talked about bus stops in phase one for extra points, we talked about serving multiple routes.
Right.
Because, you know, we have thousands and thousands of bus stops. And so, and I don't think they're all equal, and I don't know that they're all worth, the same kind of investment. So, I liked that criteria in phase one. I thought it was broad enough that it's, major intersections where two bus routes come together, or bus hubs would qualify. To me, I'd like to see a little more consistency between phase one and phase two. So I, would like to, I'm not going to move it yet, but wanted to just see what folks thought about giving it a little more focus. But I think still, again, any location that's got more than one bus service would qualify, but it gives it a little more import that it really is for the transit that the project exists. There are a lot of single bus stops that might have projects within a mile, but what's the ridership, right? And I don't want to throw ridership and stuff like that in there, but it seems like we already have a criteria we could use. So, for consideration.
I next have Councilor Shakti, then I'm going back to Commissioner Jones.
I agree with that general sentiment of tightening things up, and now I'm going to say something absolutely the opposite. I understand how to have a set distance makes it easier, but it strikes me that if you're 1.1 miles, you're still right next to it, sort of. And so I wonder if we did 1.5 miles, if that would create some sort of complexity that it's not obvious to me.
Yeah, no.
Okay, thank you.
Then I have Commissioner Jones.
So I appreciate all the thought that's gone into this, and I think we're headed in the right direction, but I had similar thoughts to Robin in that if everything qualifies, then we haven't actually accomplished too much. It doesn't help us hone our thinking for phase two and highlight things that we may want to prioritize. So I tend to think that, think favorably perhaps on Robin's suggestion, would like to work on that. I also look at the roadways. It seems like, roadway projects tend to be larger projects, and if anywhere along the course of the roadway project there's a sidewalk that runs by a bus stop, then it becomes a first and last mile project, and it feels like that's rather broad, and that we might run into the problem of running out of phase two money pretty quickly if we fund a couple of really large projects over, I think historically there have been a lot of smaller projects. So I'm wondering whether or not another potential way to focus is to make first and last mile connectivity a primary purpose of that project, so that we're really focusing on the projects that are tackling connectivity as opposed to everything qualifying by virtue of being somewhere near a bus stop at some point. So I wanted to throw that out there as a potential focusing idea as well.
Then I have Mayor Pro Tem Millay, and then and our chair, and then after that I have Councilor Stoltzman. So, Mayor
You can
Pro Tem.
share the mic. I guess first I want to make the point that this is second phase. So if we're going to just duplicate the criteria in the first phase and second phase, why are we having a second phase? And I'm going to speak on behalf of Highlands Ranch, and I think even Parker. I had a long talk with our Douglas County Commissioner this morning about bus routes continuing to be cut in Douglas County. And if you put in the multi-jurisdictional or multi-stop or multi-route bus stop, I think you're going to wipe out pretty much any chance of getting something in some of the communities that don't have as robust an RTD system as some of the other more fortunate communities. We're lucky in Lone Tree because we do have transit, and I really, really honestly truly feel that way. We are so appreciative of the fact that we have it. So this isn't for me, but this is for other communities who are struggling to get the RTD options. So if I hear what you're saying, you want bang for your buck, but if we want to increase ridership, and if we're truly trying to make these last mile connections, encouraging people to use transit, I think I almost say where you've already have these multiple routes going through, they don't need it as much as some of these communities that are really being served by 1, 2, 3 routes. So that being said, and then along Elise's comments, to me, all of these second phase criteria that we're discussing are not of equal import. And in my mind, the very small communities and the equity issues are primary for second phase, because I think small communities, we all agree, don't necessarily compete at the same level in first phase. And I think the equity issue to me is very important. The second phase pool was initially created to deal with the equity issue. And in my mind, that's kind of, when we look at themes of second phase projects, I would like to see the emphasis on small communities and equity issues, and then using some of these other criteria that we're discussing as kind of a secondary consideration in the second phase.
My comment is very similar in that I think if we want this to be a criteria that helps us select things, I think we might have to tighten it up a bit, even though within a mile I think is an important last mile project. I think if you prioritize small communities and then you say it's within a mile, I think you're going to hit every project. I can walk from one end of my town to the other in 2 miles. So, you know, if you're looking at connecting to the next town, that's every project that we do in one way or another. So I think it's important to remember what we're doing in the second phase, and I think several times Val has said it really nicely at the last several meetings on trying to make sure that we look at projects that maybe didn't count in the first phase. So while I think this will be helpful information in a table, you know, and we're not really necessarily held to these criteria, I think it might be helpful, in my opinion, if it was a smaller diameter than a mile, just to provide a little bit more screening of projects, and then, you know, kind of, well, these ones are really close and these ones maybe are a bit further away.
What I'm hearing at this point is that we are very, very close, and we have some considerations that have been raised, including the specific range and also the comment relative to these factors, because we'll have 7 when we approve this one, that these factors are just that, factors. They're not specifically weighted. I think each of us has different views perhaps on what matters. I share a lot of what Jackie said relative to the equity issue, and particularly as to very small communities. I think it's nice that they have an opportunity to participate, and again, I think she correctly stated that that was one of the reasons for the formation of the second pool. The question that I would have is, does someone have a specific recommendation then for language amendment? Does someone feel strongly enough about their point relative to, for example, the mileage? Is it 1 mile? Is it 2 miles? Is it 1.5? Is it half a mile? Does anyone have a sense that they are ready at this point to make a motion so that we could at least make sure that relative to the range, or the radius, if you will, that we have that configured here in this proposal? So, Councilor Kanish.
I would just say that I think narrowing to a smaller radius actually, you know, might kind of answer the concern that I brought up with the bus stop. And, you know, I thought you brought up a good point about the southern communities. I would say that I don't know that the last mile for the Parker park and ride though is going to be this, you know what I'm saying? It's much less likely to be a pedestrian last mile, you know, barrier in an environment where the transit is so dispersed. You know, it's a different kind of commuter transit than some of the, you know, more walkable, you know, half mile. Doesn't mean that there aren't barriers though, whether, you know, it's, I mean, we don't fund parking, but you know, maybe there's a bridge over a river or something to get off the bike trail and get from the bike trail to the park and ride. So I could step back from the bus piece if we lowered the threshold, because the distance, because I think that would, by virtue of it, just focus things better. So
I have Councilor Teal and then Mayor Pro Tem Millet.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So my comment, I would actually speak to excluding this from the criteria altogether, because, I mean, I really appreciate the definition. It was very helpful for me. I was one of the ones that spoke up in our last meeting expressing my confusion over this issue. And I think what we're seeing today with the definition we've been given is a very neat concept. The only problem is it's a concept, and now to take that next step, as our chairman suggested, it's trying to take a concept and make it real, when I don't know that that would be appropriate at all. I think then it's just kind of, I don't know, we're trying to apply definite measures to something that is still a concept. So I actually would recommend that we do not include this. I would say this is not ready for inclusion. I appreciate the definition, but considering, reflecting on what we heard from Mayor Pro Tem Millet, you know, we have other criteria for the second pass here that was created for very specific reasons. This is not specific enough, and efforts to make it specific are almost starting over from scratch. We're reinventing the wheel.
I have Mayor Pro Tem Millet, then I have Commissioner Henry, and then I have Councilor Jones.
I'm going to defer to Commissioner Henry. I already spoke on this,
Yeah.
and I haven't changed my mind.
Thank you, Jackie. I appreciate you. And it really is in support of what she had said earlier. It's not just the southern end, it's the northern end. We have also had issues with our transit and been fighting for a real long time. And I don't think it's necessarily a south end or a north end. I think it's a suburban issue. It's not, you know, we're from the suburbs. If we actually want to start encouraging people to take mass transit, we have to be able to give them a reason to do it, the reason to get out of their cars and take that mass transit. And I totally am in support of what Jackie had said, only because it's the entire region, the entire suburban. Let's remember, it's 1.5 million people that surround our urban area.
Thank you. And Councilor Jones.
So I want to speak very strongly in favor of this concept. I think it's actually borne out by the economic surveys that we've seen, that we have as a region invested a lot in transit, and now to really leverage all those investments, we need to figure out the last mile so that we can actually, you know, people take transit, they can get to their job and back. And this is a huge priority in our community, and I imagine in some other communities, to help figure that out. And so I also think it hits on a lot of our goals, whether it's use of transit, whether it's reducing VNPT, whether it's reducing emissions. This is what makes it work. So I guess in terms of motions, I think we should proceed with including it. I think we shouldn't go bigger than a mile, I'll say that. If folks want to narrow it to deal with the bus issue, I'm open to that. But last mile is kind of a tried and true concept that a lot of our communities have been hammering our way out to figure out. So I guess I would do that, and I would also I would narrow it for roadway projects and just say only roadway projects that are specifically aimed at last mile. And that way we get at lots of smaller projects and don't eat it all up in a big roadway project, because I think that gets at what you guys are talking about. If we are able in this second phase to fund a lot of smaller projects, we will fund the needs of a lot more communities, which I think is the purpose of this smaller bucket. So I guess that's where I'd head with a motion.
If I can make an observation, one thing, we have talked a little about, is it 1 mile, is it less than a mile, is it more than a mile? The offering that staff has given us, and remember, this is just an offering. It's a consideration for a way of addressing this and giving the board something concrete when they are presented with a factor that says first, last mile. It's not defined. One assumes that it's more or less a mile if there is no definition. So I think that's something that we could keep in mind. And I'll recognize Mayor Pro Tem Millet in a second, but I do want to ask, are there others who have not yet spoken on the matter? So, Councilor Vigil.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you could put that back slide again where you list all of the criteria, that one right there. You know, I think that we need to go back and stop and think why we have the second phase. And I think that Mayor Pro Tem Millet mentioned it. I mean, the reason for it is to give the small communities a chance because they couldn't compete on the first phase. Probably to get the county equity back into place, to go back and reevaluate that first criteria to see if we have some loopholes, that we have some projects that are not qualifying, and we're leaving some projects out because of that. And so my question then becomes is the first last mile, is that something that was left off the first phase? Is something that didn't qualify in the first phase? Is that why we have it in the second phase? I think we need to go back and take a look. What is the purpose of the second phase itself? Is to get the small communities, to get county equities going through there, and give those particular, especially small communities, an opportunity to compete for some of that money because they can't compete with the larger ones. And I think that, you know, we're getting way too many criteria that don't really pertain to the objective of the second phase. If not, why have a second phase? Just put everything into one phase and let it all compete.
I have Commissioner Holen first, and then Councilor Shakti. I'm sorry. Oh, I didn't see you. Sorry. Okay. Okay. And Dayak. Okay. Thank you. So, Holen, Shakti, Noon, Dayak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The purpose of the last mile concept is how do we make expenditures that will encourage people to take public transit. That's plain and simple. If we provide adequate parking, if we provide adequate access to bicycle lanes and to other methodologies by which individuals can have an easier way to make mass transit, I think that's the crux of what we're talking about here. How we provide that is what I think what the concern is, and I think the other issue relative to this is the fact that I think the other foundation I think of this issue is that smaller communities, urban communities that are suburban communities that are outside the realm of regular and adequate bus transport are ideal for this concept.
Then I have Councilor Shakti.
So I think that the aspect of equity and the small communities for phase 2 is very important, and I've been doing a fair amount of thinking since our last meeting about what fits in phase 2, what's appropriate. And I think of it as sort of a fix. We go through phase 1, we do everything we can to make it all right, and then we have this opportunity to say, okay, does this fit for us in terms of these sort of basic grounding principles? And for me, it makes sense to include MetroVision as our basic vision principle as one of those basic grounding principles. No matter what it is that we have agreed is in MetroVision at that point. And I'm not saying we need to change, I mean, we could, but last mile, I think, is clearly connected to our MetroVision principles. And so for me, that is the logic behind why this and not something else, because I agree we don't want to open the floodgates to everything we just considered in phase one. So.
Thank you. Mayor Noon.
I'm going to echo those that perhaps think it maybe shouldn't be there, because I'm going to go back to what I said at the last meeting. We don't get to control whether there's transit in our communities. That's outside of what we as a city or a county can do. And it certainly hurts those that don't get it. And when you're talking about whether it's a half mile or a mile, we have a light rail station that has no bus service. Absolutely none. Not one, not two, zippo. So talk about last mile being really important. I mean, how are we to encourage people to get on that? So whereas taking this out might hurt, I think it's going exactly to that point of what was the objective of the second phase, because I think all of those things score very well in the first phase. And if we're going to have the tip score in there, we've already taken it into account. So now we're sort of double dipping on transit when you don't have control over that in your city. And it's very difficult. In fact, I might say that I would at least put things in two different categories here, that the greater emphasis should be on very small, should be on projects not eligible, some of those other things. And then when you go down into, if you want to have this or you want to have the tip score, if you have number of sponsored projects selected in first phase, that's actually should be a negative criteria. I mean, if you're, you got to be careful where the emphasis does go on this. So I guess I would say my first choice would be not to have it, and certainly my second choice would be that we categorize these a little bit into some sort of more importance and lesser importance.
Thank you. Councilor Dyak.
And just to expound upon Mayor Noon's comment, I think we got to prioritize these, and like it seems a consensus is building towards the equity and the very small communities. I don't see a first and last mile inclusion as something I mean, to me, it should be noted, but it shouldn't be a point of overall emphasis. I looked more towards equity, very small communities. Everybody I've talked to, the mission of the second phase is to give those is more of a makeup. So for me, I don't see an issue. In fact, I would encourage us to know that it is in a first and last mile, but I wouldn't place a great emphasis on that being the deciding factor. That will be more of that constellation that Mayor Tisdale brought up. I would like to see some discussion on how we should truly prioritize this and really crystallize a process so staff can tell us how they are or not going to provide this information back to us so we can review.
Thank you. I have Commissioner Jones, and then I have Councilor Teal.
So I would note that Mayor Pro Tem Millay has been waiting, and if you'd like to go first.
You know it.
And I don't mind having the last word.
If you would like to defer, I'm sorry, she didn't catch my eye, but I apologize for
It's okay. Let's just cut to the chase here. I think we've had a really good argument and discussion, about prioritization, and I feel I'm hearing a sentiment in the room, so I'm going to make a motion. Wait, let me wait, but we can talk about it. Nobody seconded.
Commissioner Jones,
no, we're going to talk about it.
It was your call.
Wait, no. I don't want anyone to second it before Elise gets a chance to speak. I'm not trying to quash discussion. I'm just trying to say what I think I'm hearing in the room, and that we do prioritize. I'm not going to touch the last mile issue right now. That we prioritize in phase 2 very small communities and the equity issue, which in my mind, which was why this fund, this phase was created to begin with. So all I'm asking is that we honor that principle first before we discuss any of the other criteria. And that is my motion.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. I believe there's a motion on the table by Councilman Jones.
Well, I actually more appropriately to your point of order, which is well taken in substance, is that the comment made is actually not germane to this discussion. This discussion right now is whether or not we will have a first last mile factor. Then of course, we can come back to the issue of prioritization. That would be absolutely appropriate for the committee to address. But right now, we just are focused on this. So respectfully, it's although helpful and informative and beneficial to share those thoughts, I don't know that they're germane to this discussion at this moment.
Okay, well then, if
Yes,
there
we're
isn't
back to
a motion
Commissioner
on the
Jones.
table, let me put a motion on the table to include first and last mile as one of the Phase 2 criteria. If I might speak to my motion, my understanding of how
If I can get a second, I'll let you speak to the motion.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Point of order again. I thought she had a motion.
No, she did
No,
not.
I don't think I said it enough like a motion to have it qualify. So.
Yeah, there isn't a motion. So do we have a second to Commissioner Jones's motion to include a first last mile factor in the
I will second.
recommendation?
Point of order.
Yes.
I guess I'm a little frustrated with this because I feel like we've been talking about all of these, not just the first and last mile. And in my mind, before I want to make the decision about the first and last mile, I want to have an understanding of the prioritization. So I'm not going to vote in favor of the motion because I don't think that should be given equal weight to the other criteria that are listed there. And also, I would like an understanding and a question from staff as to whether or not first and last mile has already been considered in the first phase selection. And if so, other than tip score, what other things on this second phase are being considered in the first phase? So I want to know how much double counting we're getting in the second phase.
All right. If we can go to the question first, the question's legitimately raised. If staff can respond to Mayor Pro Tem Malay's question relative to the first last mile and the weighting in the first phase.
Will do. Yeah, I mean, you'll recall at the last meeting, you know, when we presented the information of the 12 or so measures that were our criteria, guiding principles that were suggested by you all for consideration, and our recommendation back to you, it did not include first last mile, and we gave our reasons for that, and we did feel at the time that you know, that we felt it was adequately covered in first phase, and just a couple areas, you know, particularly under the connectivity and accessibility points, it's weighed very heavily towards these types of projects. You know, Shakti earlier, she mentioned, you know, referring to the MetroVision and all that kind of good stuff. And we do believe that in the connectivity and accessibility portions of the criteria, as well as, you know, I mean, 25% of the TIP criteria itself relates directly to MetroVision criteria, and it relates to urban centers and all that kind of good stuff too. So yeah, I mean, and I want to preface that comment by saying, as I did last month, that you can make a case for every one of the guiding principles or criteria that you all ask staff to look at, every single one of them. And is not to suggest that we are not in favor of first last mile, because I would suggest that our criteria would say otherwise. But we tried, it was what we tried to do, and it was actually at the advice of Sue Horn, who's not here today, was try to keep it to a manageable number. And that manageable number in our mind was 6 at the time. And we tried to reflect measures that we felt were not, quite frankly, adequately covered in first phase, and those are particularly equity-related measures. Now, with that said, I can certainly understand also the other side of that, wanting to have first and last mile in there. So it's
right. So if I can restate where I believe we stand, that is that staff has responded to the question by indicating that there were considerations relative to first last mile. There are considerations as to first last mile that are contained in the first phase, but that there was a sense based upon the motion that was made at the last meeting, to have staff provide for a definition or more clarity if we were to include it as a separate element. Secondly, relative to the MVIC recommendations for second phase selection factors, we did not previously prioritize, and Mayor Pro Tem Millet would like to address that issue once we address this issue of whether or not there will be a first last mile. But before I recognize Commissioner Jones or Millet, I know that I had previously indicated that Councilor Teal.
I believe you were going to let me speak in favor of my motion before.
I'm sorry, that's right. And
For
that's
Jackie.
right. Yeah, please, yes, no, absolutely.
Jeez.
So speaking to the motion, we have Commissioner Jones.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Mayor. So I think that we have heard a lot of support for regional equity and small communities. I think that's historically been there, and I'm happy to support that as priorities. This is about what else is important in phase 2. And the reason I think that first and last mile deserves being on the list is I do think that if this is the tip cycle that is going to be commensurate with MetroVision 2040. And for anybody that's been paying attention to the staff reports on all of the interviews that they've done and the consultants' reports, first and last mile has been a consistent drumbeat of need. On the urban centers report that we just had, I believe the quote was a universal desire for multimodal transportation facilities to address first last mile connectivity. And the economic development strategy that we received from the consultant, the workforce advocates, the economic development organizations, as well as the advocates for housing, again and again noted that first and mile connectivity was key to making our investment in transit work, helping people get to their jobs and back home, to making our economy vibrant across the region. This was a linchpin that was brought up. I would also note, and I think Councilwoman Jones, I've never called her that before, noted first and last mile directly leads to not one, not two, not three, but all 4 transportation goals in MetroVision. Directly supports our land use goals around creating better density so that we can make this work. I would also note historically bike ped projects have been the most popular and the most underfunded project type that we've come up with in our TIP allocations, and I would note the same pattern is falling again. 47% of the projects submitted in this TIP cycle were bike ped projects. All of them were not first and last mile, and I would say perhaps those are the cream of the crop. But nonetheless, this is a project where you get the big bang for your buck. They're less expensive. They're more accessible to every community type in our region, and we can spread more mobility funding these types of projects rather than just a handful, and I think that is part of the goal of phase 2. So yes to regional equity, yes to small communities, but then let's shoot for the highest and best projects in terms of what we're all trying to collectively achieve for the region.
Thank you. And I have Mayor Pro Tem Millet, then I have Councilor Kanish, then I have Councilor Vigil. Anybody else before I recognize Mayor Pro Tem and Councilor Teal? All right, Mayor Pro Tem.
I agree with everything that Commissioner Jones just stated, and I also think that's why the points are being awarded in phase 1 for the first and last mile. And I think we really need to keep that in mind when we make our decision about whether or not to include this in second phase. It has been included in first phase, and staff's initial recommendation to us was not to include this and to have the other 6 that are listed there. We had discussion at the MVIC table about whether or not to include this in second phase, and I think before we made that decision we wanted it defined. So in my mind, I think the staff came up with a very good definition, an encompassing definition, but I do feel that it has been adequately addressed in phase 1, and that to do it again really is unfair to some of the people who maybe have projects that aren't eligible in the first phase, to people who have already gotten a number of projects funded in the first phase, and I just really strongly feel it's double counting, but I completely agree with you that it is very important. I think the community of Lone Tree has really leaned forward on this first last mile. We've got a first in the region shuttle bus that we've funded public-private partnership. This is an important issue. I completely agree with you, but I think it's been addressed in first phase.
Thank you. And now Councilor Kanish, and then Councilor Vigil and Councilor Teal. Councilor Kanish.
I missed the last meeting, and so I have some regret that I started out the conversation with one of the earliest comments about perhaps narrowing the criteria, because I feel like it maybe set the wrong tone in terms of this being an excluding out kind of approach. I have always felt the difference between how it's counted in the first phase and how it's counted in the second phase is it's a small number of points, but we all know that big projects tend to get funded in the first phase. They score better because they serve more people. They just, by quantity, end up scoring better. And my recollection when we actually first started the idea of first last mile, it was thrown out by suburban communities who wanted to have more attention to smaller projects that got drowned out. It wasn't this weird, who has more transit divide that's kind of emerging in this discussion. So I feel a little bit like this conversation is more polarized than it needs to be or than where it started, because it really was about small projects that tend to get squeezed out. It wasn't about some communities and not others. So I guess I would say that I feel like we don't really have any consensus emerging at the table. What we have is really, two opinions. We had some folks mentioning they thought this could be a little tighter, a little more focused, and we had some folks saying they'd rather not have it at all. I mean, given that, the staff language is a wonderful compromise. It really is, right? It's pretty broad, right? I mean, you could have a first mile project on a bus line that runs twice a day under this. That's pretty broad. I can live with that if folks can live with this being a piece that we talk about, because what I believe is it'll give us a chance to see some smaller projects that have some outcomes that relate to our regional plans. I mean, this transit is not a debatable issue. It's in our regional plan. It's been a focus. We funded it as a set-aside. These are not things that should be polarizing us this far down the road. I mean, that train has left the station. We have come together and, vociferously advocated for those investments. And this is just a chance to take a look at a way to maximize them. And so it's not a tit for a tat. 20% of projects are getting set aside for this. So I guess, not being nearly as eloquent as others, I would just suggest that what we have in front of us is probably a decent compromise that we should perhaps run with and maybe maintain a little of our cohesiveness rather than, taking this 10 more steps down the road and ending in a place that I think, again, is just, it's not really as divided as we've been. So I would like to see us take the existing language as is. I think that's comports with your motion, but if it requires a friendly amendment, I would ask for one. But I think we have a compromise on the table, and we should take it.
I have, let me just recognize people as we go in order here. I've got Councilor Vigil, then I have Councilor Teal, Councilor Shakti, and then Mayor Cernanek. And then if Commissioner Jones wants to speak also to the motion, then I'll recognize her after Mayor Cernanek. Councilor Vigil.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree that the last mile is a critical issue to take consideration into it. But if you take a look at that top part up in there, the tip score, if the last mile was considered in the first phase, then probably that tip score is higher because of that. And then now we're going to consider first and last mile again for the same project. So it's like getting a double point. I mean, I'm okay, I guess, if we leave the first and last mile, but we take off the tip score as a criteria, because you can't count criteria that brought your score up in the first phase, bring that score down, and then consider the same criteria again, because now you're double counting for that same criteria. And that's my concern, Mayor.
Thank you. Councilor Teal.
This is such a cool discussion. As a new guy, this is cool. I'm going to speak against the motion, however, mostly because I actually, Val took a lot of my thunder on that one. I really do think, you know, we do have the issue of the double counting. To Robin's point, I think you had made a valid point. The only problem is, I don't know that there's room for compromise. Just because we're either, our compromise position is to erode the last mile concept. And so, again, I speak against the motion. I would speak to have it excluded entirely. It contradicts staff recommendation. It is certainly a divisive issue that is not leading us towards, not leading us to compromise, but it is not leading us to a cohesive decision. Furthermore, I have to go back to what we heard from Eva, what we heard from Mayor Noon, and on the other side of the coin, what we heard from Bill over here. It's Bill spoke to a presumption of encouraging transit. That's a bad presumption because I come from a town that doesn't have transit. This is not going to help my community at all. And so when we get to what Eva and what Kathy said, I think they're correct. This, unfortunately, does not lead us to compromise. It actually leads us to a conflict. So I would speak against the motion and encourage everyone to vote against it.
Thank you. Councilor Shaki.
So I have not been through phase 2, but my understanding of it is that there's no points allocated and that these criteria are all the things we're allowed to consider. So when there's a discussion of, and I think a couple people talked about, they want it to be something on the list, but it's not like a priority. I think that this is required just to get it on the list. And then in terms of sort of that and also the double counting concept, that it's a little bit different because these aren't scored. They don't have a weight. They're just things that will be part of the conversation. And so just a reminder of that.
Thank you. I have Mayor Cernanek, then I have Commissioner Jones.
I'd like to at least throw support, or my support towards the motion, and it comes from a couple of things. One is recognizing that the phase 2 discussion is not formulaic, is not particularly neat, and I don't mind seeing a column with a check mark in it that has it come back, and that's for those folks that may not have gone through it. It ends up being a fairly lively discussion when we get to the phase 2. It's going to be interesting in this set of phase 1 and phase 2 in that the set aside in phase 1 for bike ped projects is actually quite a bit larger than it's been in the past. So we're going to see that, and whether that actually diminishes any carryover that might come to phase 2 from phase 1 will be an interesting exercise. But I'd like to see the consideration. I recognize that you're going to have your small communities. You're going to have those that aren't serviced by transit are going to be sitting up there probably more on a fairness list that'll probably pop up at that point in time. So I don't mind seeing it. Again, it's not a scoring. If we went back to all the scoring and we tried to get what would be absolutely consistent with MVIC goals and peel all that back, we would be at a different point at this point in time. That's just my personal opinion on that, and Rex can expound on that at some point in time. But I'd like to say, I'd like to see it. I'd like to see it mentioned. We have the possibility of having it come up in the discussion, and it's not an absolute when we consider phase 2 items anyway.
Thank you. I have then next Commissioner Jones, excuse me, Mayor Atchison, and Mayor's Representative Graves.
So in the interest of unifying this discussion, which has gotten unduly polarized, I think, given the common ground that does unite us all, in spirit of compromise, I don't know if it's appropriate in this motion or in the subsequent motion that I'm happy to make, or Mayor Pro Tem was happy to make, that we prioritize small communities, and regional equity as the top priorities, and the rest as second priorities, including the first and last mile as a second-tier priority. So that's my intention. If I can either add it to this motion or do it as a subsequent, if you have a preference on that.
Respectfully, I would suggest that it would be appropriate to include in a subsequent motion, but it's very, very worthwhile for people to consider as they're looking at this motion. In other words, if you want to make it 7 with a view toward making them prioritize in a later one, you could do that. That having been said, if someone wishes to amend the motion, they're absolutely free to, and I'm not prejudging that.
Well, I'm happy to amend my own motion to, so my existing motion is to include first and last mile as a phase 2 criteria, and I would amend that to say as a second tier, phase 2 criteria, with regional equity and small communities being a phase or a tier 1 priority, and the rest of the list being in tier 2 priority along with first last mile.
Second to the amendment?
Well, does the second accept, it's an amendment to her main motion, so does the second accept that?
Well, I guess as long as you keep calling me Councilwoman Jones.
See,
I don't know
that
about
worked.
that.
So for clarity, the motion on the table, and then I'll go back to the people that I've recognized, including Mayor Atchison and Mayor's Representative Graves, add first last mile as a factor for the phase 2, and that the 2 factors enumerated be included as the first tier in the phase 2 consideration, and the balance be in the second tier. Have I correctly stated your motion? Thank you. Let me turn to Mayor Atchison.
I want to call the question.
All right, the question has been called. We have to have, and that's on the motion as amended by the movant and the second, and the issue here is whether we wish to close debate. So we need a majority to close debate on the motion as presented. Would all those in favor please indicate by raising their hands so that we can get a count? I think we have a count. Okay. Then the motion as amended is before you. The motion as amended is to add first last mile as a criterion in the second phase, and to prioritize 2 tiers of the second phase, which is the small, yeah, the slide, thank you.
Which one? Oh.
With the factors, okay. Very small communities and what are we calling equity?
County equity, the one down bottom. That one.
County funding equity status and ratio. Thank you. So the 3rd and 6th bullets as appear on the slide would be first tier, the others would be second tier. That is the motion that stands before you now for your approval or your rejection. Would all those in favor please indicate by raising their hands?
Oh, my motion again.
All right. Now, for the sake of the record, since everyone raised their hand, who's a voting member, are there any opposed? Oh, wait, no. You know. Okay, I just wondered how many votes Denver did have.
This bada Picasso. Yeah.
All right. And then the vote is, I know it's unanimous, but is there a number I can give to? Is it 17 or 18? All right. All those in attendance and voting have voted unanimously to approve that motion, which is an exemplar of people coming together on common ground.
Point of order. That's what I tried to do at the very beginning when you told me I was out of order, so I want that on the record. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Point of order.
I make a motion we go back to first names, too. We were much friendlier when we referred to each other by first names. Let's get rid of these titles.
For the sake of the record, it's just that that you all should feel free to do that, but I want the chair to absolutely present the greatest degree of respect that you all each have earned by your service in your elected positions. Mayor Cernanek.
Question, is a motion required to take the Phase 2 recommendation to the board?
At this point, yes, I believe we should do that as modified because, and I think that's what Doug is going to help lead us through that discussion.
No, I'm going to make the motion that we have all 7 criteria as contained from our last discussion and as added to with this evening's discussion and resolution.
Second.
To the board.
Yeah, and it is the 7 criteria because you have approved 7 factors. Those 7 factors have been tiered 2 and 5. And that's what your motion is. Now,
Well, yes.
were you intending to address that specifically as part of the next steps? We have a motion.
Oh, well, go ahead and vote on that first then.
We have a motion that was made by Mayor Cernanek now to recommend this to the board as the MBIC recommendation. We have a second by Mayor Atchison, and I believe that we have a comment by our executive director.
I would just ask that you let Doug have just a moment to talk about the next steps, because if I understand you, Phil, we would bypass a couple of committees if we went straight to the board. And maybe I'm not understanding correctly, but Doug, I think, is going to suggest that we take this to TAC, we take it to the RTC, and then it goes to the board. What we would be taking to them is what you approved today, but we would suggest, I think, that we would go through the normal transportation issue committee process.
And I tell you the reason why that is, because this, we'll clean this up.
Mayor Cernanek was about to tell us that was his intention.
Oh.
Yeah, because the proposed motion had moved to recommend to the board of directors.
Correct.
And I just wanted to complete that.
Right. Well, what we'll do, we'll clean this up, and because it's an amendment to the TIP policy document, to be consistent with what we've done in the past, we'll take that through our total committee structure, and so it will be voted on by the board in November, not in October.
I'll look to Mayor Atchison, but that was my intent, was to just make sure we complete the cycle.
Right. Mayor Atchison, was that your intention as well? That's the motion as explained and clarified to comport with the practice that exists, the procedures that we must follow, such that this would be able to go to the full board in November. Does that summarize fairly your discussion you were going to have under next steps?
Yes, sir, I'm done.
Thank you very much. With that, is there discussion on the motion that was made by Mayor Cernanek as so carefully articulated and expanded upon with the dialogue that we just had? Hearing no discussion, all those in favor, please indicate by raising your hands. Are there any opposed? None being opposed, that motion similarly passes unanimously. Thank you. We did that pretty well. Now we turn to the informational item in your packets, agenda item number 5, update on the growth and development element of the MetroVision 2040 plan. We thank you, Mr. Rex, for your participation. We now turn to Brad Calvert, our senior planner for regional planning and operations. Good afternoon, Mr. Calvert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to be doing quite a bit of talking, but then I hope we can have a cool discussion too, if y'all are still in the mood. I want to give you a little bit about that was my thought of what the answer would be, but so I will move as quickly as possible. I want you first to understand the motivation for bringing something like this before you. I've been before you a couple of times, largely to share with you background and stakeholder input on subjects that, frankly, you're going to make decisions on a few months from now. But given how little time we have in these meetings, it would be impossible for me to share with you at the time sort of the rationale about why a certain policy framework is before you for your consideration. So we just think it's a good process approach to give you background along the way. And so that's what I'm doing today. We've done this previously with parks and open space as an issue. We've done it with urban centers. We had an issue paper on infill development that we've shared with INVIC and the board. We've done it with the issue of community health and wellness, and so this is just sort of a continuation of that process. So a very quick update overall on the MetroVision 2040 process. Got to spend time with several of you on Monday. If you remember, the board directed staff to form with our board ad hoc groups to look at two key issues that may be new to the MetroVision plan, both the issue of economic vitality as well as the issue of housing. Those groups met for the first time on Monday, and we went ahead and set meetings as well into now October, which is of course starting today. And they will be working on ultimately recommendations that will come back to the board in a few months on those issues. We are also working very closely with our technical committees, both the Transportation Advisory Committee as well as the MetroVision Planning Advisory Committee, to ultimately think through all of the stakeholder input that we've received over the last couple of years to ultimately put something in front of you for your consideration when we begin those conversations, most likely in January, but I'm holding out hope that we might can begin the conversation in December. So a little bit about this. This is sort of the potpourri presentation. We have a section of MetroVision currently that's called Growth and Development that looks at things like urban centers, what we call extent of urban development, which includes the urban growth boundary. It looks at rural town centers. It looks at something called freestanding communities. It looks at community design. It looks at several issues. And I'm really kind of giving you the stakeholder input related to a lot of those things kind of all at once because, frankly, overall, the stakeholder input has been that the current plan framework is actually in pretty good shape, and it's just a matter of maybe making some tweaks along the way. Sort of way background on this, obviously DRCOG is a regional planning commission under state rules, and so we've been creating plans for the physical development of this region since the mid-50s. And really those plans have consistently been, okay, what is our desired physical development of the region in the future, and then what are the public actions that we as a region take to ultimately ensure that that desired future happens. Oftentimes that conversation ends up being related to issues like transportation facilities. So here's what that looks like sort of in today's nomenclature. So obviously we do the overall MetroVision plan, which lays out that regional vision. We have a process to identify, well, what are the public infrastructure investments related to transportation that we need to invest in to actually make that future tenable. But then we have the reality conversation of how much money do we have, and then what are our current short-term priorities. So we obviously just had some of that conversation just now, but that's generally kind of how it all fits together. In terms of stakeholder engagement activities, we've been doing quite a bit for the past 2 years, and I'm giving you sort of an example. These are kind of the global things that we've been doing where we aren't really asking about specific issues. We're honestly asking kind of the larger question of what do you think this region needs to be in the year 2040. Sort of put your very long-term hat on and ask yourself what, as a region, do we want to look like in the future, and then maybe what are some of the steps that we need to get there. So that includes a lot of engagement with the public through our listening tour, which actually is now about 2 years old. We've also completed a local government survey last year where we asked all of our local governments to sort of give us information about key challenges that they're facing. The board directed us to form 2 committees to actually assist in the process to develop the plan, both a new technical committee, the MVPAC that I mentioned, as well as a citizens advisory committee. So they've been very involved in sort of thinking through these issues, and we've also done a lot more in the web space as well. But we have also done more directed stakeholder engagement efforts, particularly related to the things that I'm going to talk to you about today. I've grayed out 2 of these, urban centers and corridors and infill development, because we've already come before you and talked about those conversations. And so today I'm going to kind of fill out other comments that we've heard along the way. But we've done focus groups, we've done interviews, we've done surveys, we've done a lot of one-on-one meetings, obviously a lot of committee conversations as well. So we've been pretty robust in our overall engagement process. To kind of give you the general sense of what this section of the plan is right now, it is really about understanding what the physical development of this region will be in the future, what we want it to be. And that's very consistent with really what our mandate is as a regional planning commission. With these outcomes, obviously we want efficient and better use of existing infrastructure, but we also want to understand, as we continue to invest in infrastructure, where are the places in the region that make sense to make those investments. And we want to make sure that those development patterns are ultimately contributing to a larger set of regional goals, including things like VMT reductions. And then obviously that the built environment does meet the needs of the widest array of people in the region. And sort of the note at the bottom is something I said previously. In general, the feedback that I've heard is that the section that we have right now is actually in pretty good shape. It just maybe needs a little tightening in some places. One big issue, which if for the new folks here that have not been through this process, but this section of the plan does include what is called the extent of urban development area of the plan, but it really does focus in on the urban growth boundary. If you haven't lived through this and you stick around for a while, you will, and you'll understand why it gets so much attention. But for those that weren't around, in March of last year, the board actually directed staff to let's delay that allocation process until after the plan is adopted, which is currently scheduled for June of next year. And I really just wanted to inform you that I haven't heard really a lot of stakeholder input that was not the right move. There's a little bit sort of conversations going on regionally about current allocations, but people do have a lot of flexibility to make emergency requests. They have the ability to manage their own allocation. So overall, that decision, in my mind, has not been really met with any real stakeholder engagement that would suggest that maybe we needed to open that decision back up. So a little bit about the listening tour. Like I said, it was this sort of global, what do you want the region to be in the future? 200 or so interviews, as well as about 1,100 or so folks participated in an online survey. And this is sort of the highlights related to kind of growth and development issues. And the two that you see under the first one really have been things that have been echoed throughout this process, not just in that engagement activity, but pretty consistently, is that yes, as a region, we should be focusing on dense mixed-use development around the investments we're making in transit, but also understand that one of the things that makes us successful as a region is that we have particularly housing and other opportunities in rural and suburban locations as well. And frankly, we want it all. I mean, that's what we heard very loud and clear from the public. We did get quite a little bit of discussion about the current urban growth boundary and sort of what our idea is as a region as to what our urban future or urban footprint will be in the future. And generally, folks didn't think that it would be much different than it is from today or how we would forecast it in 2035. I will also be the first to admit this is largely from the public that maybe don't have the best concept of what the urban growth boundary is. And I've got another slide that talks a little bit about how your staff saw sort of a similar question. But we also heard a lot, and this is what was really encouraging to us, because I think if you've been around this table long enough, thinking about how this region responds to the aging of the population is something that's really important for us and is also very important in your own communities. Sort of unprompted, the public is sort of seeing the same thing. They recognize that thinking about how people age in this region is something that we really do need to begin to take very seriously. So as I mentioned, when asked of your staff, do you really think that allocation of urban growth out into the future is adequate? Most of yes, that they actually do feel that the current allocation is adequate, but there were some that either frankly did not know, maybe they had not thought about the issue. One of the things that has been tough on the UGB front is that we had a recession and a big development slowdown, so it's just not been something that people have thought about in the last few years. And about 5 or so folks said that in their minds, their current allocation was actually not going to be adequate for future growth. Another thing that we wanted to gather from the local government survey is, how are we pulling out of sort of the overall slowdown? And this survey is now a year old, but by and large, it was universal that people are really actually seeing an increase in development activity in their communities. And that really what's interesting about it is that it is oftentimes can be characterized as redevelopment, infill, or people picking up what were previously considered dead projects and ultimately rethinking them. And that creates quite a bit of challenges at the local level. My sense in sort of thinking about this over the last year since the survey came out is, frankly, the projects that are coming up are actually really complex and interesting at the local level. They're requiring zoning amendments. They're requiring comp plan amendments. They're actually very interesting projects that ultimately are creating a lot of opportunity to sort of think about the future both at the local and the regional level. So that's sort of some global things and sort of getting into two areas that are specifically designated in the growth and development section. For those that don't know, MetroVision has, for quite a bit of time, recognized distinct communities for what we call freestanding communities and 13 rural town centers, and I'll talk a little bit more about each of those. Rural town centers is, again, 13 of those kind of scattered farther out into the region, really came into play in the MetroVision 2030 process as really sort of towns or villages outside of the urban area that could ultimately be places that serve the needs of rural and suburban areas, maybe outside the urban portions of the region. Most of this is in the attachment, so I won't necessarily spend a lot of time on it, but we completed 4 interviews to sort of understand what issues these folks are facing, and they were pretty similar, all 4. And I think that last one was really interesting that maybe we had not heard previously, is really they are seeing the lack of immediate access to primary health care is a growth constraint on them. It's hard for them to ultimately add, particularly the housing that they want to add with that barrier in place. And so that's something to think about sort of long-term going forward. Freestanding communities, as I mentioned, there are 4 that have really been on the books since the very first MetroVision plan. So Boulder, Brighton, Castle Rock, and Longmont. And I would just basically tell you what in our conversation specifically with those communities, it was largely let's just keep the plan as it is. So what you see up there is not really stakeholder engagement. It's more what's on the books right now. And in the general sense from those communities is that it actually works really well for them at the time, at the moment, with the one sort of asterisk there being several of them are actually going through comprehensive plan updates right now, and they would like to revisit this issue after they go through that process, and I think that's a really good approach there. So some other things to sort of the potpourri portion here. There's a current section in MetroVision 2035 that's called large lot development that ultimately speaks to development that happens outside of the urban growth boundary. And it really was added after the original MetroVision 2020 plan where the urban growth boundary came into being, because people were recognizing, well, there's still development that happens on the outer edges of this region. We shouldn't just ignore it. And so that's something that's been added. And one of the things that has come up in the stakeholder engagement process is that right now that section really focuses almost exclusively on residential development, and there are other uses and land uses that happen in those areas as well, and we should maybe broaden the overall scope. So what's in the attachment that you have in your packet is a summary of a focus group that we had with communities that ultimately are more likely to have those large lot type developments. But what I put on the slide is, and when we talked about this with one of our technical committees, kind of the input that we received from them is, some folks wondered, why are we even thinking about development outside the urban growth boundary in our plan framework? Shouldn't we be focusing really exclusively on what happens inside the urban growth boundary? But we did hear sort of an affirmation, particularly from the counties around the table, that they are seeing a lot of areas that had been previously approved for more like rural estate type development, where developers are coming back and looking to intensify those developments, potentially making them places that get closer to what urban is as defined in the growth and development supplement. So that's something that I think counties in particular are dealing with, and that there is significant pressure both sort of in the tourism side of things as well as sort of natural resource issues. So, sort of speaking to the fact that it's not just about residential development anymore. There are other uses that really are putting development pressure out on the sort of the farthest edges of the region. And that agriculture is obviously a big use as well that should be considered going forward. So there is a section in MetroVision 2035 that is currently labeled as community design. It actually sort of comes from a focus on senior design or senior-friendly community issues that was added back in the 2030 plan. But in 2035, it was amended to really make it a little bit more global in its focus, and to focus on people of all ages, incomes, and abilities, but to also really keep that emphasis on older adults. I mean, obviously, you all understand kind of what's going on demographically in our region, and it will be a challenge that both in the near term and the long term that we do need to focus on, and that the current section that's in the plan was really shaped actually by NVIC quite a bit, as well as a subcommittee of the Advisory Committee on Aging called the Livable Community Subcommittee, which really did shape that transition, both the original version as well as the transition to the plan element that's present currently. So as much as we tried to broaden that section, and the stakeholder input that we've received over the last 2 years has really focused on the aging of the population and making sure that communities really are prepared for this. And that it really, we as the plan as well as sort of local actions and regional actions should recognize that this is a primary challenge this region will face over the next 25 or 30 years, particularly in sort of your non-urban, whether that's suburban or rural areas. Those places are ultimately going to have very high levels of older adults in their communities, and they're going to have to determine how to ultimately meet those needs. And we heard quite a bit from the development community that the places that ultimately are really attractive to build new product, like historic older downtowns, older adults are attracted to those areas, but they can be really hard to actually create areas that are really age-friendly in the most global sense. And it's great that people are thinking that way, but we should recognize how difficult it is to ultimately think community-wide about creating a place that really is age-friendly. And some of this I shared with the housing group, but and I hate to sort of talk about housing because that section doesn't really exist yet, but with growth and development, it's kind of hard to ignore it. The need for senior housing in this region has been universal. I mean, that has been something that has come up in every single conversation. People are throwing out the word crisis. When you have senior developments that open up with 55 units, and the day that it opens, it has a waiting list of 800 people. I mean, that tells you sort of what's going on in this region in terms of people really needing housing options that meet their needs going forward. And that really, frankly, there's just not enough supply. People are looking to make choices that ultimately their housing or their locational choices that can make being independent easier for them, and there's just simply not the supply of product out there. Luckily, people are actually patting DRCOG and our communities that are working on the Boomer Bond on the back and saying it's a good start, and we should continue to be thinking through really what the strategies should be going forward. To kind of give you a little bit of, we began kind of a conversation with the MetroVision Planning Advisory Committee on this section last month, and they talked about a lot of different things, but ultimately I think it kind of boils down to really two key points that when this comes to you, I hope ultimately we satisfy this, and that's, we need to recognize that MetroVision 2040 should really be relevant and resonate with every single community in our region. We heard from people around the table that it doesn't right now. The word that appears in your attachment is, it feels urban-centric. And frankly, I could see why they would have that opinion. And so we have to think, collectively about how do we actually create a vision for this region that ultimately resonates with as many communities as possible. At the same time, we do need to recognize that historically the plan has recognized and prioritized growth and investment in certain areas, whether that's the urban growth boundary or urban centers, rural town centers, freestanding communities. We have created a plan framework and a growth framework that does ultimately prioritize growth in certain places, and that really is rooted in the fact of hoping to save a cost savings, particularly on the public side for infrastructure. But one of the things that came up at MVPAC is, well, that ultimately may also make private sector development more expensive. And there is tension in that, and I think that's something that we just need to recognize and make sure going forward that it's something that the plan can adequately address. So a little bit about next steps. We are continuing conversations with our technical folks. Their charge is to ultimately take this stakeholder engagement that we've been doing for the past 2 years and ultimately put something in front of NVIC and the board that is the best reflection of that stakeholder input and where really what would be the plan that resonates with as many people as possible, and to set the table for the policy conversations that NVIC and the board will have later this year, more likely into early next year. We're also working on sort of improving some of the clarity and overall structure of the plan. This section in particular, like I said, most people have said it works pretty well, but I think it has some clarity issues that could be improved. It has some sequencing issues that ultimately would probably help really communicate what the vision is for the region. And then obviously we have, at least for now, written in pencil, hopefully pen, that we really would like to have the plan adopted in the June timeframe of next year. And Mr. Chair, that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Brad. Are there questions for Mr. Calvert from any of the members of MVEC? Mayor Cernanek?
Just a real quick question on this, Brad, and you don't have to necessarily answer it at this stage, but as we're looking for the build-out of the region to accommodate the population change, will the document have the list of assumptions or constraints on that? And I'm just carrying it over from a morning discussion we had about water as an example.
Yes, one of the things, as you can imagine, we are actively drafting and writing and thinking through these issues through, right? The sort of the placeholders that we have now is, yes, there is a section that has been written that frankly just builds on what was in the previous plan that talks about key challenges, issues that ultimately we're responding to, including the aging of the population, but we have many other things going on in this region that frankly require regional attention. So yes, there is this sort of setup piece that does that. Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Calvert? Yes, Commissioner Jones.
Maybe I should know this, but I remember years ago in a prior life dimly that DRCOG did scenario planning associated with some of its, I think, MetroVision work. I'm just curious whether or not any of that kind of modeling and benchmarking is planned as part of this, because as I remember, it was rather complex, but every metric that we were looking at, from tax dollar investment to water conservation to air emissions to traffic, did better based on the land use priorities that DRCOG was emphasizing. And it's useful to sort of check in with that periodically, and I'm just curious whether or not any of that's planned.
Anything that would replicate, there was some work done in probably the 2007 or so time frame. We did do scenario analysis sort of the latter half of last year that really focused on the measurable goals that are currently in MetroVision 2035, right? If we're taking various land use and transportation assumptions, how far do we get towards achieving those goals? And I think the board was briefed on that a couple of times, probably in the November, December time frame of last year. And just as a reminder, you know, that ultimately still rang true, particularly focusing population and employment around transit and urban centers ultimately had many beneficial impacts related to the transportation goals that are currently in the plan.
Commissioner Jones.
It might be useful to, well, I certainly needed my memory refreshed, but as we have new members, it might be useful to bring that information back up to the degree that it's going to continue to guide us going forward with the 2040 plan.
Happy to do it.
Any other questions for Commissioner Partridge?
With the challenges of construction defects in any of your housing shortages, are you looking at modeling, if we did have those products, what would be available, what we would have as shortages, price ranges? Are you putting that as a model, since we know there's a certain percentage of for sale multifamily, typically, as we understand, 20–25%, I believe we're down to 2% in our area. So have you factored that in, modeled that in when you're looking at housing shortages and prices?
We're not currently modeling that, no.
Okay. Could you?
That would be a tough thing to model. I mean, obviously we have the housing diversity study that we worked on a year or so ago that lays out some of the barriers associated with it, but that would be a pretty difficult leap to sort of isolate those impacts to understand. I mean, I think you can point to historical trends like you're pointing to, but modeling it may prove to be pretty difficult.
Right. I think it would be valuable to at least have some indication what we suspect. I mean, there's nothing wrong with making an educated guess.
Sure.
Valid. Are there other questions for Brad? Brad, thank you for a very thorough presentation, and your memo was very helpful as well, obviously, and informed a lot of us as to those issues. Are there any other matters to come before the MVIC from any member? Hearing none, this is... Wait, I'm sorry. Oh, I missed you. I'm sorry, Robin. Yeah.
Really fast. I went to the Railvolution conference this year. Hadn't been for a number of years. It's like rail, transit, and also like placemaking. And I actually think it would be great if we thought as a board in the future conference. It'd be fun to go with a few of us to kind of debrief afterwards. There were a lot of MPOs there, staff, and talking about projects. And so I just, you know, I found it very interesting. I learned a lot about things happening on federal transportation requirements that we haven't talked about as much here, things like what's happening with New Starts funding, in part because we're not a transit agency, but they affect us. And so, so just a thought, I don't know if we ever do that for national conferences, but I love learning what other regions are doing. It's not something that I feel like we do very often in DRCOG, get like cross MPO fertilization. So I throw it out there as an idea, and a resource, and I'm, would love any chance we get to do more of that. I think is great. We learned a ton about Minneapolis's MPO, Tennessee, Nashville. Is it Nashville? There were a lot of really great stuff. So anyway, just in case others get that kind of curiosity, I'd love to do more of that. Thanks.
Thank you. Mayor Cernanek?
Just a footnote, if Robin's willing, could we take 8 or 10 minutes for her to maybe give us some of the concepts at our next meeting?
Yeah, and I am informed by Flo Rattano, our truly renaissance member of our staff, that the Revolution Conference will be in Denver in 2016 and 27. Is it 2017? I'm not sure which it is. Yeah, in one of those 2 years. So that would be helpful, and we can ask staff to address Mayor Cernanek's request and see if Councilor Kanish would be available for that. Are there any other matters to come before MVIC from any member? Our next meeting will be on Wednesday, November 5, 2014, the day after our general election, so we all look forward to that.
Some more than others.
If there is nothing else to come before MVIC, then we stand adjourned at 5:48. Thank you all very much.
If you need a parking validation ticket, come and see me.
Well, we had staff at Revolution. How you doing? Hey, good. How'd you like it?
Parking? Who's got parking?
Connie's got parking.
Connie's got parking. Mine got parking. We didn't carpool today.
Oh,
Kind of a
you
bummer.
got my text?
Yeah, you did. Oh, did you? What's he doing?
Doing good.
What did you think of our? I thought it was fabulous. You did great. I had an opportunity to share that with some people here in information. We took that and the DEA and the Sheriff's Office Corporation. We had, I am told, 125 pounds in cherry. It doesn't surprise you that much if you think about it. So that was great. All right.
Thank you for being there.
Thank you. Actually, very nice seeing you here today, and I got your name right.
You did it perfect.
Today
Thank you.
I did better. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, we'll see you folks. Take care.
Bye, Doug.
Back to the phones.
Yep. Good luck. Hi. It never fails, right? It never fails, never. Yes, Jerry, I am.
Stick this in first and that in second.
And then this in second.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for coming to me. See you later. Well, and really, oh my right. I was hopeful that it would be short.
But I am starting to see certain things circulate. Comment-wise.
On, yeah.
Okay. Highlighted things in red, so if we.
Okay, I'll send that over to you.
Okay.
And if you have any
I
questions.
just know where some of the questions are.
Sure.
especially since Mr. Janino is going to be there.
Well, I did not put that one specifically. Can I trust them? Who do we get models to? What is the consultants? Do we approve it?
Well, yeah, I would.
I didn't get a lot.
I just sort of leave it at
Those were the questions we got asked last time.
Okay, so I'll be here like 7:30-ish.
Okay.
I'll see Denver and they want to dissect a model.
Oh, okay, this is a follow-up to what we talked about the other day?
Yeah. Nick says, gotta be something we're doing wrong, right?
Well, they want us to make changes to our model so they can pin their decision about I-70 on whatever the DRCOG model says. It's like, this is your problem to solve, not ours.
I'm sorry. You know, I never want to leave this
I
room.
know I'm not going to pick up any of that stuff.
I know, I just don't ever want to leave here.
It's the water that I'm eyeing.